Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week 7 episode of the Off the Charts podcast. I'm Greg Thomas of Sports Info Solutions, filling in for Scott Spratt this week, and we're joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. As you wrote in your article this week, the Eagles have returned to the top spot in DVOA, and that sets up a really solid divisional matchup between two top 5 DVOA teams this week, but also created some other interesting DVOA tidbits. Obviously, defeating the Vikings allowed the Eagles to jump them in DVOA, but what went into the Eagles creating such a large gap between themselves and the number 2 DVOA team, the Seahawks, this week?
Well, I mean, this game was pretty big itself. So that's the first thing, right? I mean, it was a big win, and it was a big win against a really good team. So Philadelphia ended up with a rating of 61.3% for this game. That was the best single game rating for any team in Week 7. But overall, I mean, the Philadelphia being number 1 is in large part a product of the fact that there are no balanced teams this year. And so by being number 1 in defense and special teams, that's what makes the gap. Basically, there is very little difference between the top 4 teams, Philly, Seattle, Denver, and Minnesota, in offense or defense, right? I mean, those are 4 of the top 5 defenses. And in offense, they rank anywhere from 17th to 24th, but they're all just a little bit below average. But in special teams, Philadelphia is way far ahead of the other 3 teams. Now, I don't know how quite sort of repeatable that is along, the whole season, because the big reason for it is kick returns, because they have 2 kick return touchdowns and nobody else has any. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have kick return touchdowns for the rest of the year. One thing I've always looked at doing for special teams that I haven't done is shortening really long return value in the same way that we shorten the value of really long pass plays.
Okay.
But it's not quite the same thing. The reason why we shorten really long pass plays is you can only get a 90-yard touchdown pass if you're on the 10. You can't get that if you're further on the field. But kickoffs pretty much always come down in the end zone, so you can pretty much always get a 100-yard kickoff return for a touchdown. So I don't know if shortening it actually makes sense or not in the same way that it does for runs and passes. But kick returns that's what makes Philly stand out. They're also second in kickoff value behind the Patriots, and they're 5th in value on field goals and extra points. But mostly it's the kick returns, and when you put all the special teams together, that's the big difference between them and the rest of the top teams.
Yeah, this game happened to be the game I had on a secondary TV while I was watching, and it seemed like every time I looked up, there was a turnover, or Bradford was getting hit, or in one case, like you said, Josh Huff was running with the ball with no one around him. The Eagles were 4th this week in getting pressure on the quarterback defensively, doing so 23.4% of the time. Overall, it totally makes sense why the Eagles were able to jump from 5th and 4th to 1st overall in both defensive and special teams DVOA.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting about that game was when I looked at the pressure numbers was that that Minnesota only got pressure on Philly something like 3 or 4% of the time, and yet they still had Carson Wentz pretty confused in this game. They didn't bring the kind of pressure that they normally bring, and yet Wentz didn't have a good game. They won this thing entirely with defense and special teams. And the offense has really fallen off in the last few weeks for Philadelphia. I mean, 3 weeks ago, when they were undefeated, the Philadelphia offense was 4th in offensive DVOA. Okay, now 3 weeks later, and I believe only 2 games later, they are now 24th in offensive DVOA. Right.
Yeah, that's actually a good kind of segue. I know you guys, you and Scott talked about Wentz and Prescott in Week 3 and how they were doing great in their rookie campaigns. And they both, kind of continue their success for the most part. And Prescott has remained near the top in yards per attempt. He's 5th overall at 8.17 yards per attempt. And Wentz was lower at the beginning. He's around 19th now at 7.16. But other than just the overall DVOA numbers dropping, is there anything else you've seen between those 2 quarterbacks since Week 3?
Yeah, overall, Prescott is playing better, but part of it is Prescott's got better stuff around him, right? Look at the Philadelphia offense is 19th in passing and 19th in running. The Dallas offense is 2nd in passing and 1st in running. You know, Prescott's got a better running back, and he's got a much better offensive line. I mean, the Philly offensive line is good in places, certainly, but they're not what the Dallas offensive line is, especially with Lane Johnson suspended on the right side for Philadelphia. And, I mean, getting Des Bryant back should be a step even further forward for the Dallas offense, because one of the things about them right now, the Dallas offense, is that in the red zone, they are 4th running the ball, but only 15th passing the ball. But, you know, Des Bryant's greatest strength is his ability to use his body to shield away defenders in the red zone and catch touchdowns. Right. So that should be just another improvement for them.
Right, and you would think, if anything, his yards, or Prescott's yards per attempt, are going to go up with Des. So it'll be interesting to watch. And speaking of Dallas's offense, and like you said, they're currently number 1 ranked in offensive DVOA, and the Eagles are number 1 ranked defensive DVOA, and both rank kind of 20s on the other side of the ball. And this should lead to like a pretty good matchup this weekend. You've said in your DVOA articles the best defenses are stronger than the best offenses so far, and that continued to be the case. Eagles at negative 26.6 DVOA and the Cowboys at 22.7 DVOA. Now the game's in Dallas, but are you kind of expecting to see the Eagles being able to still get pressure on Dallas, or what are you expecting this week?
Oh, I think the Eagles will get pressure, but not as much as usual, and I'm sure that Dallas is going to run on them plenty. The Philadelphia defense is number 1 against the pass and number 13 against the run. So that's not the best mix when you're going up against the Dallas offense. The Dallas defense is 22nd against the pass and 8th against the run. So Philly, you know, they'll have some success passing too. And Philly's definitely had better special teams this year. But I think that the home field makes it that Dallas, I think, should be favored in this game.
Gotcha. And as a kind of a quick sidebar, one of my coworkers who's a Lions fan also noticed this week that not only will we pit the number 1 offense versus the number 1 defense, but also the number 32 offense in Houston versus the number 32 defense in Detroit. So you might want to check that out as well this week.
Yes, that is the classic example of the resistible force versus the movable object.
Yeah. And speaking of the Lions, I know via Twitter you were actually able to attend the game there this weekend. Can you just talk a little bit about what's gone into the Lions' current winning streak and all the hype that's surrounding Stafford currently?
Yeah, like, it's hard to tell. The Lions' current winning streak doesn't make much sense. I mean, even having watched them in person, I feel like it doesn't make much sense. I felt like, you know, they were winning that game for most of it, but, you know, it was because weird stuff was happening with Washington, missed a field goal, and Matt Jones fumbled on the 2 into the end zone, and Detroit was able to jump on it and get the ball back at the 20. And then Washington came back and scored, and we thought it was over. And then all of a sudden, in the last minute, Washington just couldn't cover anybody, and Detroit just went down the field, bing, 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 on like 4 plays, scored a touchdown and won. But the fact that Detroit is 4-3 doesn't make much sense based on the play-by-play breakdown, right? They have the worst defense. They have a slightly above average offense. They have good special teams, but their best special teams games have been in losses in weeks 2 and 4. Those are the really good special teams games they've had. They have good punting. That's mostly what they've had this year, is good punting from Harris. So it's a really strange, like, combinations of things. Some of it is, I mean, Stafford is doing it all himself, right? So Detroit's offense is 7th passing, 28th running. Okay, so just because I say that Detroit's offense isn't that much better than average, that's not meant to be a knock on Stafford. He's top 10 in DVOA. He's top 10 in the ESPN's QBR. So he's definitely having a really good season. There's not much running game there at all. I mean, the offense, the Jim Bob Cooter offense, we've talked about this a lot. It's what Vince wrote about in the chapter in the book, that it really took advantage of the ability of some of those receivers to gain yards after the catch. Stafford doesn't throw deep as much as he used to. Obviously, no Megatron there. He doesn't feel like he has to force it to anyone. The ball gets spread around. But with that defense playing so poorly, it's kind of weird that they are 4-3. And every one of their games has been close. Every single Detroit game this year has been within a touchdown. Their 4 wins are all by 4 points or less. So it seems like a team that should be ranked, around average, middle of the league, but they're actually much lower than that. It's just a really strange combination of occurrences that they've somehow managed to win these games, despite the fact that they have been outgained by their opponents 6.3 yards per play to 5.8 yards per play.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so I'll just move ahead on to our next topic. It actually brings me, and maybe you, a bit of deja vu from last year when I filled in for Scott for the first time. We discussed then interim coach by Dan Campbell, Miami Dolphins having a 2-week resurgence by effectively running the ball. And surprise, the Dolphins once again are on a 2-game winning streak while effectively running the ball, though this time through back-to-back 200-yard games by Jay Ajayi. I think most of it this year starts with the health of the offensive line. In Week 6, the Dolphins were finally able to line up their envisioned starting offensive line before the season of Brandon Albert, Laramie Tunsil, Mike Pouncey, Jermon Bushrod, and Juwan James, after a Week 5 disaster that included Billy Turner himself having 4 blown blocks, according to our charting, and being unceremoniously cut along with 2 other offensive linemen that week. While Ajayi has seen an improvement from his first contact standpoint, he was seeing his first contact 1.61 yards into his runs the first 5 weeks, and now at 3.13 yards the last 2. He's essentially maintained his broken tackle rate, which was 0.243 broken tackles per touch before Week 6 and 0.236 broken tackles per touch after and including Week 6. Have you seen similar things about Ajayi in your data?
First of all, I feel that no discussion of Jay Ajayi can go without at least mentioning the comedian Franklin Ajayi. Everybody should go check him out on YouTube. He's very funny. Every time I hear about Jay Ajayi, all I do is think about Franklin Ajayi. It's interesting because this team does not have much of a passing game. I mean, it's funny because when they cut all those offensive linemen, it was like, is this a little too much? I mean, maybe those guys are still valuable as backups, but I don't know whether it's, quote unquote, sends a message to the team. But the blocking's obviously been a lot better. So the problem is that they're 27th passing the ball. So eventually they're going to have a game where they can't just run. They fall behind early, or the opposing team plays good run defense, and then what are they going to do? I mean, the offensive line is a good example of this. It's not just Ajayi versus Tannehill. The offensive line is 3rd in adjusted line yards, 29th in adjusted sack rate. It's a tremendously one-sided offense. And they're going to end up at some point where they have to play teams that have a good run defense. And then what do they do? I mean, they're not passing the ball very well. None of their receivers really scare people. Landry's a good possession guy, but that's all he is. I mean, they play the Jets, right? So that's going to be the matchup of opposites. The Jets on defense are the worst pass defense in the league. Sorry, they're 31st now. They moved ahead of Detroit thanks to those interceptions of Joe Flacco. And they are the 3rd best run defense in the league behind Baltimore and Green Bay. So, if the Jets can stop Ajayi, what on earth do the Dolphins do? I guess they pass against the Jets defense that's playing horribly right now against the pass, but it'll be a weird game to see sort of whose strengths and weaknesses, win out.
Right. Kind of based on your answer there, I think I know how you're going to follow up this question. But last year, in those 2 wins, the Dolphins beat the Titans, who were 14th in DVOA at the time, and the Texans, who were 31st. This year, they took out the Steelers, who were 4th at the time, and the Bills, who were 3rd at the time. Now, right afterwards, they played the Patriots, and that ended any semblance of thinking maybe they could turn this around. But this year, they're on a bye. But is there anything you could see that would lead you to believe that Dolphins this time could continue their success, or no, because they're so run-heavy, and as soon as they're stopped, they're not going to be able to do much?
Well, I mean, I think that they've played a little bit better overall this year, and these wins are a little bit better because they're against better teams, so that convinces you that maybe that things will be a little bit better, and that their defense has been average and their special teams have been average. Miami is sort of the most average team in the league. They're actually kind of the most well-balanced team in the league. Miami and Chicago are the most well-balanced. The problem is that they're not balanced and good. Miami is balanced and averaged, and Chicago is balanced and below average. And Miami's really only balanced if you look at overall offense and defense, because on offense, obviously, they're tremendously imbalanced. So, I mean, the fact that they did it against better opponents would suggest that there's a better chance of them continuing things because the defense played better, right? Their defense kept down the Buffalo offense well. It kept down the Pittsburgh offense well. But, of course, some of the explanation for that is that Roethlisberger got injured in the middle of that game and then came back and clearly wasn't healthy. So I have a hard time seeing Miami as a serious contender. But, you do have to give them credit. They're a 16th in the ratings and 3 and 4, and both of those are better than I thought they would be at this point.
Right. And I kind of saw exactly what you just brought up. I know in your DVOA article you had that the Bills were the only team with 3 top 10 units, 7th in offense, 16th, or not top 10, but above average, 7th in offense, right. 16th defense, and 6th in special teams. And I noticed that the Dolphins were 16th offense, 14th defense, 18th special teams. So consistent but mid-level, which is exactly what you said.
Yeah, now the thing is, if you look at the average opponent, Miami has one of the easiest remaining schedules. Look at the rest of their schedules, and it's really bad teams. Jets, Rams, 49ers. I mean, Jets twice. Mm-hmm. Rams and 49ers. Cardinals, who are not as good as we thought they were before the season. Ravens, who are not as good as we thought they were before the season. The problem is that 5 of those games are on the road, and they still have to play the Patriots. Yeah. And they still have to play. At Buffalo. And I mean, beating Buffalo by 3 points at home is not a sign that you're going to destroy them when you go on the road. It's maybe a sign that you're equal. So Miami's got some easy opponents, which should lead to wins, but I just don't think there's enough of it for them to make the playoffs this year. I just don't think they can get past Buffalo and all 3 AFC West teams, given the easy schedules that the AFC West teams have.
Right, and that kind of leads me into my next thing. So I saw the Bills actually took the biggest hit in playoff odds this week at 24.7%. Obviously, losing to a division opponent is costly, and that kind of makes sense, but they're still sitting at 51.1% for the season. What are your feelings with them versus the AFC West teams as it pertains to their wild card opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I am a strong believer in the AFC West teams because of the AFC South teams on their schedule. Yeah. And I just, I mean, the Bills, it looked really good there for a while, but there's always the sort of subjective sense. I mean, this is not a numbers thing, right? But there's always the sort of subjective sense that eventually the Rex Ryan circus becomes a circus. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to ask me right now what I really think about the playoffs, I would say that I would expect 2 AFC West teams to win the wild cards. That being said, I mean, the Bills have a much better chance because basically at this point it's 2 divisions. We have an AFC North team winning a wild card like 10% of the time, and an AFC South team winning a wild card like 5% of the time. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's down to the AFC West, Buffalo, and a little bit Miami for the wild cards. There's not going to be wild card contenders from those other 2 divisions, and so that gives Buffalo a better chance. It's they basically have to get past AFC West teams, but I don't know whether they can do it. I mean, part of it is Oakland. Our ratings don't think Oakland is as good as their record. Mm-hmm. But, does that mean that they're going to fall off? Or is it the kind of thing where perhaps the kind of talent that conventional wisdom believes they have will eventually start playing kind of up to their record? That does happen sometimes, right? I mean, when you have a team that has a better record than its underlying play-by-play, but has a lot of young talent, their actual performance will get better because they have the young talent. People thought Oakland might be better than this before the season. Our numbers didn't, but a lot of people certainly did. Right. So just for Buffalo to get past them, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, that's why we've got Buffalo has the highest chances of a wild card of any team this week. They win a wild card in 35% of simulations. Oakland wins one in like 34.7%, and Kansas City 27.8%. Denver 31.6 because they're all the simulations where they lose the division, and that's the thing is that for Buffalo to get the wild card, they not only have to get past two of the four AFC West teams, because don't forget San Diego's still in it.
Mm-hmm.
But, we'll have to see which AFC West team wins that division. I don't know. Buffalo's in it, but you always feel like the Ryan circus is going to show up.
Yeah. Kind of last point on this game, watching it, all of the rankings and where they were DVOA kind of made sense. Each team showed flashes in each facet, except for really the Dolphins and special teams, where they allowed a 30-yard punt return that was costly, and they also held on a punt, which made them re-kick, and then that kick was subsequently blocked. Also, in reading some of Adam Gase's comments this week, he kind of brought up a point that with the loss of Rashad Jones last week, they had to shift some players that are key special teams players over into offensive or defensive roles. This week being Michael Thomas playing more safety, and of course going forward with Arian Foster retiring midweek, that'll mean Damian Williams and Kenyon Drake have to move into backup running back roles, and they're pretty key in special teams. Is there any way to factor in the injury of a key player, not only like the loss of them, but shifting other people's roles and how that affects the teams, or do you just kind of have to wait and see how it plays out from a DVOA perspective?
Yeah, I think wait and see how it plays out, but it's absolutely something to think about. It's not something we can incorporate in any kind of numerical projection during the season. I mean, It's hard enough to incorporate any injuries. Mm. We try to, certainly when I do the playoff odds, we incorporate quarterback injuries, and we try to incorporate the major running back injuries, which, by the way, also gets us to another reason why you're hesitant to think of Buffalo as a likely wild card team, because they're going to have to go without LaShawn McCoy for a few weeks now. Mm. But as far as the impact of team on special teams, that's absolutely a thing. But my guess is that it's a small thing. It probably only tips a team's odds of winning or losing slightly, because you're talking about a small change on special teams, which itself is only a small part of the game. It's certainly not any kind of a major factor, right, but it's certainly, one of a number of factors. And, every so often the game will come where it's the straw that broke the camel's back, when some special teamer makes a terrible angle on a tackle and it lets the other guy return the punt for a touchdown.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so the other thing that's happened Dolphins-wise so far this year, in special teams that have been detrimental, are a bunch of short missed kicks. Now they had two of them blocked and one of them just shanked. But this kind of brings up a topic that you mentioned in your DVOA article about the struggles that field goal kickers are having this year. You said you kind of didn't have time to write about it in the article, but you wanted to expand upon it in the future. Is there anything that you've been able to find to kind of explain these struggles?
Yeah, I'm going to write about it Thursday afternoon or Friday. I don't know about explaining these struggles. I can tell you about these struggles, okay, but it's hard to explain. I'm certainly not a technician of field goal kicking to go watch all the kicks. I've read a little bit of breakdown of what's wrong with Stephen Gostkowski, but of course he's not the only kicker this year to be suffering through some kind of yips. Blair Walsh has had problems, a guy who's been a pretty reliable kicker in the past for Minnesota, and Catanzaro has had problems for Arizona, and Stephen Hauschka has had problems for Seattle, and Nick Folk had been good in the past, and he's had problems. And every year for special teams, the baselines do not equal zero every week in the same way that they do for offense and defense. I have to manually tweak them. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to manually tweak them too far, because I don't want one bad week by a couple of kickers to make it seem like the league baseline is much lower than it really should be in the long term. But this year has been a little nuts. If you paste in the baselines that I used in 2015, and you look at week by week, every single week except for week 4, kickers have been below average. So overall, field goal percentage is at 83.9% compared to 84.5% last year. But remember, that's 84.5% last year for the whole season, including November and December, when the weather gets worse, rain, snow, colder weather, the ball doesn't travel as well for long kicks. So if you look at the baseline from last year, it suggests that through week 7, the league as a whole is 5.4 points below expected without the weather adjustments. and 39 points below expected with weather adjustments. Ooh. If I remember correctly, last year through about this time, the league field goal percentage was somewhere like 86.5, 87%. And it is just kind of astonishing how many kicks are getting missed, especially in the over 50 range, right? So there have been 18 field goal attempts of exactly 50 yards this year. Mm-hmm. 8 of them were missed.
Oh, wow.
Last year, that would have been like 4. There have been 10 kicks of 54 yards or more this year. And not 54 yards or more, sorry, 54, period. Half of them have been missed. It's just, I mean, they're just missing kicks that in the past they would kick, it would hit all the time. I mean, not 100% for 50 plus, but usually guys would hit those like half the time. And this year they're not. It's just kind of astonishing. And then even short kicks are being missed, like the 27 to 31s, where guys were usually going at a 95% rate. This year it's more like 90%. So I don't know what's causing this, but it's kind of weird.
Yeah, and obviously on the national stage, you kind of saw, I believe, 2 of them happening in the Cardinals and Seahawks game last week, resulting in the 6-6 tie. But it's very interesting to see.
And the most remarkable thing is there are 2 guys who so far are totally not touched by this. And that's Vinatieri and Justin Tucker. Vinatieri and Justin Tucker have not missed a kick at all this year. Greg Zuerlein of the Rams also has not missed a kick this year. And Matt Bryant has only missed 1, and that one was a 58-yarder. But other than those 4 guys, I mean, almost everyone is having problems.
Yeah, and it makes sense, again, seeing what's happening going on in the league. So I believe that brings us to everything we want to cover this week. There's a bunch of good matchups on the schedule, particularly later on Sunday, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. I hope everyone enjoyed the podcast and continues to subscribe and read all of Aaron's articles and content over on Football Outsiders. Thanks again to Aaron for joining us, and we'll talk with everyone again next week.